A 14-year-old boy found himself handcuffed, humiliated, and thrust into the justice system for a crime he did not commit. Yet, when he entered that courtroom, he accomplished something that no one anticipated. He turned the entire case on its head. Zion Whitaker was not in a hurry. The journey to school was a routine he knew well, a 15-minute walk along cracked sidewalks and worn storefronts. It was early in the day, with the sun barely piercing to gray, overcast sky. His backpack, slung over one shoulder, felt unusually heavy, perhaps due to the impending debate competition or the history exam he'd been cramming for all night. Regardless, today felt like just another day, until it wasn't. A sudden blast of sirens jolted him from his thoughts. Ahead, flashing red and blue lights illuminated the pavement, reflecting off the glass windows of a nearby hardware store. Zion slowed his pace, adjusting his hoodie as he glanced at the scene unfolding. A shattered window, yellow tape being put up, and an officer conversing with the store owner. Then he heard a commanding voice shout, "You?" Hands where I can see them. Zion barely had time to comprehend what was happening before a police officer charged toward him, hand poised over his holster. It was Sergeant Roy Kincaid. The name was familiar to locals, though not for its protective nature, but rather for his tendency to harass. Zion's hand shot up instinctively, his heart racing. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice steady. But the question lingered in the air like a challenge. Kincaid didn't respond. Instead, he seized Zion's wrist, yanking it behind his back with force that sent pain shooting up his shoulder. The second hand followed, locking him in cold steel cuffs that felt uncomfortably tight. "We got him," Kincaid barked into his radio. "Got who?" Zion's voice trembled as the harsh reality began to sink in. "Don't play dumb," Kincaid muttered. "Security footage places you near the store when it was hit. You match the description." Zion's mind raced. What description, he thought. He had merely been walking. He hadn't even approached the store. "Sir, I didn't do anything." Kincaid scoffed. "A dark hoodie, sneakers, young black male, that's the description." A small crowd had begun to gather. People slowed their cars. Some pulled out their phones, but no one stepped forward to help. Zion's heart pounded as the officer shoved him toward the squad car. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be real. But as the cold door slammed shut behind him, the realization hit hard. His life would never be the same again. The interior of the squad car reeked of sweat and worn leather. Zion sat rigid, wrists still restrained behind him, every small movement causing the cuffs to bite deeper into his skin. He longed to scream, to demand they check the security cameras, to actually examine the footage. But he knew better. The ride to the station was brief, yet it felt like an eternity. The officer in the front seat, one Zion didn't recognize, barely uttered a word. Upon arrival, he was yanked out of the vehicle, his backpack left behind. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the room was cold, an oppressive chill that seeped into his bones. The first thing they took was his name, followed by his fingerprints, and then even his shoelaces, as if he were some hardened criminal about to throw away his life. A weary-eyed officer seated him in a metal chair. "Your mother has been notified," he said flatly, as if this were just another routine procedure, just another child being processed. Zion swallowed hard. Thinking of his mother, Lorraine Whitaker, a single parent who worked 2 jobs, the hardest working woman he knew, she was the one person he couldn't bear to see worried. Minutes dragged on, then an hour, and finally, the heavy door swung open. Lorraine rushed in like a tempest, her eyes locking onto Zion, searching for any sign of injury. But when she turned to the officer, her voice was filled with fury. "Where is his lawyer? What is he even being charged with?" Sergeant Kincaid stepped into the room, arms crossed, his badge gleaming under the lights. "We have surveillance footage that places him near the crime scene. A store was broken into, tools were stolen, and he fits the suspect's description." Lorraine's nostrils flared. "And that description is what? A dark hoodie and sneakers?" Zion watched as his mother clenched her jaw, her hands balling into fists at her sides. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain composed. "My son was simply walking to school." Kincaid shrugged. "That's your claim." The rage in Lorraine's eyes could have burned through walls, but anger alone wouldn't free Zion. Finally, A man in a wrinkled suit entered, flipping through a folder as if he had just skimmed over Zion's case for the first time. The public defender barely glanced at Zion. "They're offering a plea deal." Lorraine's head snapped toward him. "A what?" The lawyer exhaled, clearly fatigued. "If he pleads guilty, he can avoid trial, receive probation, and do community service." Zion's stomach dropped. Best option? Plead guilty to something he didn't commit? Just like that? His mother's voice turned steely. "We're not signing anything." The lawyer sighed, as if he had encountered this situation countless times. "I understand, Miss Whitaker, but these cases don't usually end well." It's his word against the police officers. A trial could mean... Lorraine cut him off. Zion's fingers curled into fists. His mother was right. They weren't going to simply accept this. What terrified him wasn't just the system working against him. It was the way everyone in the room had already predetermined his fate. But Zion refused to let them dictate his future. That night, he barely slept, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying every moment from the police station, the handcuffs, Kincaid's smirk while talking to his mother, the public defender pushing that plea deal as if it were the only escape. Though he wasn't a lawyer, he knew something was fundamentally wrong. By morning, his decision was clear. If nobody else was going to advocate for him, he would fight for himself. At school, he skipped lunch and headed straight to the library. The legal section was small, mostly filled with outdated textbooks and reference materials, but it was all he had. He grabbed a thick book titled Criminal Procedure and flipped through the pages, scanning for anything that could help him grasp a situation. He started with the basics. The burden of proof. The prosecution had to establish his guilt, not the other way around. The chain of evidence. If the police mishandled evidence, it could be dismissed. Witness credibility. A cop's word held weight, but inconsistencies could dismantle their testimony. The more he read, the clearer things became. They had nothing on him. No fingerprints, no stolen items, just a grainy video of someone in a hoodie. Then it struck him. How tall was the suspect? Zion wasn't particularly tall for his age, standing at 5 feet 4 inches on a good day. What if the person in the video was taller? What if he could prove that it wasn't him? He grabbed another book titled Cross-Examination Techniques. That was when the librarian, Mr. Langford, a graying man with thick glasses, approached him. "What's all this?" he asked, glancing at the stack of books. "Just researching," Zion replied. Langford scrutinized him for a moment. "You in trouble, kid?" Zion hesitated. He could lie and say it was for a school project, but something about the old man's gaze made him sigh. "Yeah." Langford pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "Then you better know what you're doing." For the next hour, Zion explained everything. How he was accused, the plea deal, the lack of evidence. Langford listened, nodding occasionally, then leaned back. "You have good instincts, but court isn't just about facts. It's about how you present them." Zion nodded, taking notes as Langford laid out the essentials of courtroom strategy, how to make a jury see the truth, how to instill doubt, how to ask the right questions. By the time he left the library, Zion's notebook was brimming with ideas. He wasn't merely hoping for justice anymore. He was preparing for battle. The real test awaited him, and he knew the courtroom wouldn't be as forgiving as the library. The courtroom smelled of aged wood and coffee. Zion sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped together, his heartbeat a steady drum in his chest. His public defender, the same man who had barely acknowledged him at the station, sat beside him, flipping through his notes as if he hadn't even read them. Across the room, Sergeant Roy Kincaid sat stiffly in his uniform, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Yet Zion could sense it, the confidence, the certainty. This was not a man who believed he would lose. When the judge entered, an older man with silver hair and deep lines etched on his face, Zion felt the weight of expectation settle over the room. The prosecutor stood first, a woman in a navy blue suit with a voice as sharp as a blade. She wasted no time. "Your Honor, the evidence is clear. The defendant was seen near the crime scene, matching the description provided in the footage. Sergeant Kincaid, a veteran officer with over 20 years of service, detained him based on probable cause. We believe the case speaks for itself." Zion gritted his teeth. Probable cause. Those two words had stolen days from his life. The prosecutor turned, walking toward the jury. This case isn't complicated. The store was broken into, stolen goods were taken, and who was seen nearby? The defendant, wearing a hoodie and sneakers. It all adds up. She made it sound so neat, so obvious. Zion's fingers curled into fists. Then the public defender stood. Zion had no idea what he was about to say, but he wasn't hopeful. The lawyer adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and muttered, "My client maintains his innocence. We intend to show that the evidence does not conclusively prove he committed this crime." That was it? That was the best defense he could muster? Zion closed his eyes for half a second, forcing down his frustration. He had prepared for this. He wouldn't sit idly by and watch himself be thrown under the bus. The judge turned to him. "Mr. Whitaker, I understand you wish to speak on your own behalf." Zion took a deep breath. His mother was in the back, watching, holding her breath. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, his voice steady. "I do." The judge studied him. "Proceed." Zion stepped forward, glancing at the jury. He had one chance. "Let's talk about the evidence," he began, or rather, the lack of it. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Zion pointed at the prosecutor's table. "The security footage, where is it?" The prosecutor shifted, then nodded toward a screen. "We were just about to present it." The video played. A grainy figure in a hoodie moving quickly. The store's window already shattered. The person's face completely obscured. Zion folded his arms. "That's it." The prosecutor frowned. "That is you." Zion shook his head. "No, it's not." Silence enveloped the room. He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, may I ask a question?" The judge nodded. Zion looked at Sergeant Kincaid. "Officer, how tall am I?" Kincaid blinked, caught off guard. I don't know. 5 feet 4 inches?" Zion pointed at the screen. "Then tell me why the store security camera logs indicate the suspect is 5 feet 9 inches. A pause hung heavily in the air. The prosecutor shifted, and Kincaid's jaw tightened. Zion's pulse raced, but this was just the beginning. The courtroom fell silent. Not the kind of silence that felt empty, but one that held weight. Zion stood his ground, his heart pounding in his chest, but he didn't let it show. He had just exposed a significant flaw in their case. The suspect in the video was 5 feet 9 inches, while he was 5 feet 4 inches. Now, everyone in that room was aware of it. The judge leaned forward. "Prosecutor, do you have an explanation for this discrepancy?" The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. "The footage quality is poor. It's difficult to make an exact measurement." Zion shook his head. "Not according to the store security system." He turned toward the jury, his voice steady. "Most modern cameras have a height scale at the entrance, designed to measure individuals during a robbery. The footage you're viewing has that height marker right there. The suspect walks past it." Kincaid shifted in his seat. He had to know. The prosecutor sighed. "Even if the height isn't exact, the hoodie and sneakers match, which still places you at the scene." Zion didn't flinch. He was ready for this. "With all due respect, that's not how evidence works." He turned back to Kincaid. "Officer, did you check my shoes when you arrested me?" Kincaid's fingers tapped against the armrest of his chair. "Of course." Zion nodded. "And were they the same shoes the suspect was wearing?" Kincaid hesitated for just a moment, but everyone noticed it. The prosecutor cleared her throat. "We don't have to prove every detail." Zion interjected. "Yes, you do." Another ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Zion wasn't a lawyer, but he had studied the law. The law states you must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And right now, there's doubt all over this case. The judge turned to the prosecution. "Do you have any direct evidence linking the defendant to the crime?" The prosecutor hesitated. "The officer believes." Zion repeated, his voice unwavering as he locked eyes with Kincaid. "That's not evidence, that's a guess, and guesses ruin lives." The atmosphere in the room was tense. Then Zion took a slow breath and stepped forward. "Your Honor, may I submit something to the court?" The judge nodded. Zion pulled a folded paper from his pocket and walked toward the bench. "This is a record of Sergeant Kincaid's disciplinary reports." The prosecutor's eyes widened. The judge raised an eyebrow. "And where did you obtain this?" Zion maintained a calm expression. "It's public record." The judge took a moment to flip through the pages, and the tension in the room shifted. Finally, he looked up. "Sergeant Kincaid, is it true that you've had multiple complaints filed against you for wrongful arrests?" Kincaid's jaw tightened, his fingers twitching. "That's irrelevant." Zion turned to the jury. "Is it? Because I believe it matters that the officer accusing me of a crime has been caught doing this before." The prosecutor looked ready to object, but the judge raised a hand. Zion felt it, the shift, the doubt. For the first time since this nightmare began, he was winning. But the biggest revelation was yet to come. The courtroom felt different now. The air had changed. The confidence on the prosecution side had cracked. The jury no longer viewed Zion as a suspect. They saw him as a young man who had been wronged. Sergeant Kincaid appeared visibly tense. His usual air of authority had been stripped away. Zion could see in the small shifts of Kincaid's posture, the tight grip on his wrist, the way he avoided eye contact. Then the judge announced, "We will take a brief recess before the jury deliberates." He glanced toward Kincaid. "And I want a word with the prosecution in my chambers." That was never a good sign. Zion sat back down, breathing carefully. His mother reached forward from the row behind him, squeezing his shoulder. "You were brilliant," she whispered. But he wasn't celebrating yet. 20 minutes later, everyone returned to their places. The jury filed in, and the bailiff called the courtroom to order. The foreman stood. This was it. The judge nodded as the jury reached a verdict. The foreman cleared his throat. "We have, Your Honor." He looked directly at Zion. "On the charge of burglary, we find the defendant, Zion Whitaker, not guilty." A rush of relief flooded Zion's chest. Lorraine exhaled sharply behind him, her hands pressed together in silent prayer. But the judge wasn't finished. He turned to the prosecutor. "After reviewing the evidence and the new information presented, I am instructing the district attorney's office to open an internal investigation into Sergeant Kincaid's conduct." A ripple of shock spread through the courtroom. Kincaid's face turned crimson. "Your Honor, this is absurd." "I'd be very cautious about what you say next, officer," the judge interrupted firmly, "because this court has seen enough today to question whether you should be wearing that badge at all." Silence enveloped the room. Zion watched as Kincaid sat there, trapped, just as he had been days ago. But Zion was no longer the one in cuffs. The judge cleared his throat. "This trial is adjourned." The gavel came down. It was over. Zion turned, and before he could react, Lorraine enveloped him in a tight embrace. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. But even as relief washed over him, Zion realized this was no longer just about him. If Kincaid had done this to him, how many others had been silenced? But Zion wasn't finished fighting. Not yet. Outside the courthouse, the sky felt vast, the air lighter. Zion had walked in as a defendant. Now he walked out a free man. But freedom felt different when you had to fight for it. Reporters gathered near the steps. Cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. "Zion, how does it feel to prove your innocence?" someone shouted. He paused, his mother's hand resting on his shoulder, steadying him. He could have said many things, that he felt relieved, that he felt angry, that he felt exhausted. Instead, he looked straight into the cameras. "I shouldn't have had to prove my innocence." Silence fell, then murmurs, people scribbling in no-tep, ads. The weight of those words settled heavily in the air because that was the undeniable truth. Zion hadn't just fought against a wrongful accusation. He had battled against a system designed to break individuals like him, and that system was still standing strong. Lorraine guided him past the crowd, but before they reached the car, a voice called out, "Hey, kid." Zion turned to see Mr. Langford, the school librarian, standing there with a few of his classmates, even some kids he didn't often speak to. "You did it," Langford said, nodding in approval. "You made them listen." Zion swallowed hard. "Yeah, but what about the kids who don't get the chance?" Langford studied him, then smiled. "Then maybe it's your job to ensure they do." Those words resonated deeply with Zion because he understood now that it wasn't just about him. In the days that followed, the internal investigation into Sergeant Kincaid became public knowledge. More stories surfaced, revealing numerous names of other children who had faced similar injustices. Some had taken plea deals just to escape the nightmare. Others had lost years of their lives to wrongful convictions. Zion had won his case, but the fight was far from over. 1 week later, he walked back into the school library, a notebook tucked under his arm. Langford looked up from his desk. "What's that?" he asked. Zion set the notebook down on the table. "A list." Langford raised an eyebrow. "Of what?" Zion exhaled. "Every law I've been reading. Every right people need to know. Every trick they use to keep people quiet." He pushed the notebook forward. "I want to help people, kids like me, so this never happens again." Langford smiled. "Then you'd better get to work." Zion nodded, fully aware that justice doesn't come easily, but when you fight for it, you make it harder to ignore. This fight was just beginning. He started organizing workshops at school, teaching his peers about their rights, the legal system, and how to stand up against injustices. He shared his story at community events, inspiring others to speak out against their own experiences. As time passed, Zion became a beacon of hope in his community. His determination to advocate for others grew stronger. He collaborated with local organizations focused on criminal justice reform, working tirelessly to raise awareness about the issues that plague marginalized communities. He connected with other young people who had faced similar struggles, forming a support network that empowered them to share their stories. Zion's voice became a powerful tool for change. He learned how to navigate the complexities of the legal system and even began to mentor younger students, guiding them through the challenges they faced. His journey transformed from one of victimhood to one of advocacy and leadership. Years later, as he stood before a crowd at a rally advocating for justice reform, Zion looked out at the faces of those who had come to support the cause. He felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. He had turned his pain into purpose, and in doing so, he had become a catalyst for change. With his mother by his side, he spoke passionately about the need for systemic change, the importance of believing in one's innocence, and the necessity of fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. "We must stand together," he declared, "to ensure that no one else has to endure what I went through." As the crowd erupted in applause, Zion knew that his fight was far from over, but he also understood that he was no longer alone. Together, they were forging a path toward justice, one step at a time. And in that moment, he realized that true freedom comes not just from being acquitted, but from standing up for what is right, advocating for others, and ensuring that their voices are heard. The journey had begun with a young boy wrongfully accused, but it had evolved into a movement for justice and equality. Zion Whitaker was not just a survivor. He was a warrior for change, and he would continue to fight for a better future for all.